Everyone feared the rude billionaire, but a waitress showed he wasn't so tough after all. Richard Blackwell slammed his fist on the table at the Wellington restaurant as all eyes turned to him. The most powerful man in New York City was red with anger over a dish that arrived 5 minutes late. "You're incompetent," he shouted at Margaret, the 62-year-old waitress who had worked there for 15 years. "How dare you serve me cold food?" The silver-haired woman tried to explain that the dish was at the right temperature, but Richard wouldn't listen. With a sudden movement, he threw the plate on the floor, scattering sauce and pieces of meat everywhere. "Now you'll get on your knees and clean this mess with your bare hands," he ordered, pointing to the floor. "To learn not to waste my time." Margaret hesitated, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Everyone in the dining room pretended not to see, including the manager, Michael, who relied on Richard's investments to keep the restaurant running. The other customers looked down at their plates, pretending nothing was happening. That's when Emily Parker, 26 years old, put down the tray she was carrying and approached the table. The young waitress had only worked there for 3 months, but she couldn't stay quiet seeing such humiliation. "Margaret doesn't need to kneel for anyone," said Emily, helping her colleague up. "I'll clean this up for you." Richard turned to her with an icy glare. The 58-year-old businessman was used to everyone obeying without question. His grey hair was perfectly combed, and his imported suit cost more than many people earned in a year. "And who are you to interfere where you weren't called?" he snarled. "Look at you, girl. Poorly put together, with that poor look on your face. You should be grateful to have a job." Emily felt her blood boil, but remained calm as she bent down to pick up the pieces of the plate. At that moment, the pitcher of orange juice on the nearby table slipped from her hand and fell right on Richard's head. The orange liquid ran through his perfectly combed hair, stained his designer suit, and dripped onto the floor. The restaurant fell completely silent for a few seconds. "You did that on purpose!" exploded Richard, rising from his chair. "Michael, I want this girl fired right now." Manager Michael rushed to the table, visibly nervous. He knew Richard could ruin his restaurant with a single phone call. "Emily, you're fired," said Michael with a trembling voice. "Get your things and leave." Emily looked directly into Richard's eyes, showing no fear or regret. "Accidents happen to anyone, Mr. Blackwell," she said calmly, "even to people who think they're too important." Before leaving, she approached Richard and whispered something in his ear. The words were so quiet that no one else could hear, but the effect was immediate. The businessman's face paled, and for the first time in years, someone saw fear in his eyes. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. In the following days, Richard couldn't get the incident out of his head. He had ordered an investigation into Emily's life and discovered that she alone cared for her sick mother, Evelyn, who suffered from diabetes and needed expensive medication. Both lived in a small apartment in the Queens neighborhood and were now struggling without her salary. No matter how hard he tried, Richard couldn't forget the words Emily had whispered. "Your mother would be ashamed of the man you've become." They were just 8 words, but they echoed in his mind day and night. For the first time in decades, his conscience began to trouble him. He remembered Dorothy, his mother, who had worked as a cleaner her whole life to raise him and his 2 brothers alone. She always said that money without dignity was worthless. Richard tried to ignore these thoughts, but the nightmares began. Every night he dreamed of the restaurant scene, but this time it was his mother in Margaret's place, being humiliated and forced to kneel. He then decided to send money anonymously to Emily. He put $5,000 in an envelope and sent his driver, Robert, to deliver it to her apartment. To his surprise, the envelope came back intact the next day, accompanied by a handwritten note. "I don't need charity from someone who doesn't know the value of dignity." The refusal left Richard even more intrigued. In his 40-year business career, he had never encountered anyone who refused his money. He decided to go personally to Emily's apartment to better understand who that young woman was who dared to challenge him. The building in the Queens neighborhood contrasted completely with the luxurious penthouse where Richard lived. The walls needed painting, the elevator made strange noises, and the hallway smelled of cheap disinfectant. When he rang the bell of apartment 402, he heard voices coming from inside. Emily opened the door and her face immediately closed upon recognizing him. "What do you want here?" she asked, keeping the door only slightly ajar. 5 minutes, requested Richard. "I just want to talk for 5 minutes." "I have nothing to say to you," replied Emily. "Please," he insisted. "I know you refused my money. I want to understand why." Emily hesitated. All her life she had been taught by her mother to never refuse a civilized conversation, even with difficult people. 5 minutes, she agreed, opening the door. "But stay right there in the entryway." The apartment was small but impeccably clean. Richard could see Evelyn in the kitchen, a 64-year-old woman preparing lunch with few ingredients. There was only rice, beans, and some greens on the table. "Who is it, dear?" asked Evelyn, appearing in the living room. "It's, an acquaintance from work, Mom," replied Emily, avoiding giving details. Richard looked around and noticed how everything there was simple but lovingly organized. The curtains were well ironed, the floor shone from being so clean, and there were some small plants decorating the window. It was very different from his home, full of expensive objects but empty of life. "I came to offer you your job back," Richard said to Emily, "with a salary increase." "I already said I don't need charity," she replied, "and I don't work for people who treat others like trash." Evelyn, who didn't know who Richard was embarrassed by her daughter's sharpness. "Emily, don't be rude to visitors," scolded her mother. "Have you had lunch, sir? We don't have much, but what we have, we share." The simple and genuine offer took Richard by surprise. It had been so long since anyone had invited him to something without an interest in his money that he had almost forgotten what it was like. "I don't want to intrude," he said. "It's no trouble at all," insisted Evelyn. "Emily, set another plate at the table." During the simple lunch, Richard observed how Evelyn spoke about her life with dignity, even in the face of difficulties. She told how she had worked as a seamstress until her diabetes worsened, and how proud she was of her daughter who worked hard to support them. "My Emily has always been courageous," said Evelyn, smiling at her daughter. "Since she was little, she doesn't tolerate injustice. Once in school, she stood up to some boys who were picking on a younger classmate." Richard ate in silence, remembering the simple lunches his mother used to prepare when he was a child. Dorothy also worked miracles with few ingredients and always said that food made with love had a special flavor. When he finished eating, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine gratitude for a meal. It wasn't about the taste of the food, but the care with which it was prepared and offered. "Why did you whisper that at the restaurant?" he asked Emily when Evelyn went to get coffee. "Because it was true," she replied without hesitation. "Any mother would be ashamed to see her son treating other people that way." "You don't know me," said Richard, but his voice lacked the aggressiveness from before. "I saw enough that day," Emily replied. "I saw a powerful man humiliating a hard-working lady just because he could. I saw someone who forgot where he came from." Emily's words hit home. Richard lowered his eyes and for the first time in decades felt tears forming. "My mother's name was Dorothy," he said with a choked voice. "She cleaned offices in the early morning to give me an education. She died when I was 25, just as I was starting to prosper in business." "And what would she say if she saw you today?" asked Emily, but her voice now had less harshness. Richard remained silent for a few minutes. Evelyn returned with the coffee and noticed the heavy atmosphere, but said nothing. "She would say I lost my way," he finally admitted. "When I became rich, I swore I would never be humiliated or vulnerable again. I built walls around myself and forgot that there are people on the other side too." "Wealth without kindness is poverty of spirit," said Emily. "My mother always taught me that. But if I show weakness, everyone will want to bring me down," explained Richard. "The business world is cruel." "True strength is having the courage to be kind in a cruel world," replied Emily. "Anyone can be hard and insensitive. That's not strength, it's cowardice." Richard left the apartment with a lot to think about. In the following days, he began discreetly visiting Emily's building, always with an excuse. He brought fruit because it was left over at home, showed up with diabetes medication that an acquaintance didn't need to use, made up that he needed to talk about a job. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Evelyn, with her simple wisdom, began teaching Richard things he had forgotten. She showed him how to make freshly brewed coffee, taught him old recipes that her own mother used to make, and told stories from her time as a seamstress. Little by little, Richard rediscovered pleasures that money couldn't buy. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. At the office, his employees noticed that he stopped yelling and started greeting people by name. During a meeting, when a manager suggested firing employees to cut costs, Richard asked how many families would be affected and vetoed the idea. His partners were confused by the changes. During a business lunch, Thomas Wilson, his right-hand man for 10 years, tried to probe what was happening. "You've been different, Richard," commented Thomas. "The investors are noticing. They think you're getting soft." "I'm learning there's a difference between being respected and being feared," replied Richard. "In our line of work, they're the same thing," insisted Thomas. "You always said kindness is a luxury we can't afford." Richard reflected on his partner's words, but didn't change his attitude. The following week, during an important meeting to decide on a new real estate venture, the executives presented a project that would bring huge profits, but would displace hundreds of low-income families. "It's a golden opportunity," explained Jessica Thompson, the project director. "We bought the land for cheap and built a shopping center. The return will be at least 300%. The old Richard would have approved without hesitation, but now he was thinking about the families who would lose their homes. To everyone's surprise, Emily was present at the meeting. He had hired her as a personal assistant, against her initial wishes, and she only accepted because she needed the job. "And the families living there?" asked Richard. "It's just 50 houses," said Jessica, as if that weren't important. "We can offer some symbolic compensation." Richard looked at Emily, who was watching him silently. He knew she was thinking about the words they had exchanged about courage and kindness. "Project rejected," he said, causing general astonishment in the room. "But Richard," protested Thomas, "that's a lot of money we're leaving on the table." "Money that comes from other people's suffering doesn't interest me," Richard replied firmly. The partners exchanged worried glances. After the meeting, Thomas sought him out privately. "If you keep this up, we're going to have serious problems," he threatened. "The other investors won't tolerate this change in behavior. You could lose everything." "Then let them take it," replied Richard. "I already lost what really mattered once. I won't lose it again." The news of his change spread quickly through the business world of New York City. Old adversaries he had humiliated over the years began to appear, some collecting emotional debts, others simply curious to see if the transformation was real. One of them was Nathan Miller, a former employee Richard had fired publicly 5 years earlier, humiliating him in front of the entire company for a small mistake. Nathan showed up at the office asking to speak with him. "I came to collect something you owe me," said Nathan when they sat down in the room. "If it's money," Richard began. "It's not money," interrupted Nathan. "It's an apology. Public. Just like you humiliated me in front of everyone." Richard's pride still resisted the idea of apologizing publicly, but he remembered Emily's words about courage. The next day, he organized a meeting with all the employees who were present at the time of Nathan's dismissal. "I made a serious mistake 5 years ago," Richard said before everyone. "I humiliated Nathan Miller for a small error and fired him cruelly. I want to offer a public apology for my behavior." Many employees were in shock. Some didn't believe the sincerity of the apology. Others were moved to see the boss admit a mistake. Nathan was surprised by Richard's genuine humility and accepted the apology. But the problems were just beginning. The company began to lose important contracts. Clients who preferred the ruthless shark from before cancelled deals, saying they no longer trusted his new version. The financial pressure increased considerably. During a tense meeting with the board of directors, the advisors suggested that Richard return to his old methods to save the company. "This kindness phase was interesting," said Jonathan Brooks, one of the largest investors. "But now we need results. The shareholders are losing money." "If you want the old Richard back, you can find another partner," he replied firmly. Emily, who was taking notes at the meeting, noticed Richard's internal struggle. After everyone left, she approached him. "Are you regretting the changes?" she asked. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'm destroying everything I built," admitted Richard. "Money earned through other people's suffering isn't worth peace of mind," said Emily. "You can rebuild your company based on respect. It will take longer, but it will be something lasting." Richard Blackwell decided to completely restructure the company, implementing ethical values even though he knew it would mean initial losses. He created a code of conduct that prioritized employee well-being and the social impact of projects. The employees who once feared him began to genuinely respect him. Productivity increased because people worked motivated, not out of fear. Richard discovered that leading with respect generated a loyalty that fear never could. But the biggest test was yet to come. Mrs. Evelyn had a diabetes crisis and needed to be urgently hospitalized. The treatment was expensive and complicated, requiring delicate surgery and imported medications. Emily finally accepted help from Richard, but insisted it be a documented loan that she would pay back through payroll deductions. "We don't need a contract between us," said Richard. "Yes, we do," insisted Emily. "I want our relationship to be based on honesty, not charity." During the days Mrs. Evelyn was hospitalized, Richard spent several nights at the hospital keeping Emily company. It was the first time in years that he genuinely worried about someone other than himself. "Why are you doing this?" asked Emily in the early hours of the morning as they kept watch over Mrs. Evelyn. "Because you showed me what a real family is," replied Richard. "I had money, but I didn't have love. You have little money, but a lot of love." The hospital experience made Richard even more sensitive to the suffering of others. He saw families despairing because they had no money for treatments, sick children whose parents sold everything to pay for medicine. He decided to quietly create a fund to help employees of his company facing medical difficulties. When the news leaked to the press, Richard received hundreds of thank you letters from current and former employees. Many shared personal stories of how the help had changed their lives. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. However, not everyone was happy with the changes. Jeffrey Harris, a rival businessman who had always envied Richard's success, decided to take advantage of what he considered a weak phase to attack. Jeffrey spread rumors that Richard had gone mad and was no longer reliable for big business deals. He managed to influence some important investors who scheduled a decisive meeting to evaluate whether they would maintain their partnership with him. "You'll lose money if you stick with Richard," said Jeffrey during a dinner with investors. "He's become a dreamer. In the business world, that's a recipe for failure." The meeting was scheduled for a Friday at Richard's office. Emily noticed how nervous he was in the days leading up to it and offered to accompany him, but he preferred to face the situation alone. In the meeting room, Richard found 12 serious investors who represented much of his company's capital. Jeffrey was also present, with a malicious smile on his face. "Richard, let's get straight to the point," said Edward Fitzgerald, the leader of the investor group. "We're concerned about the changes in your business behavior. Profits have decreased, and you're making decisions based on feelings, not numbers." "Is it true you rejected the shopping center project that would yield millions?" asked another investor. "I rejected it because it would mean taking homes from 50 families," replied Richard. "See?" interjected Jeffrey. "He's more concerned with strangers than with his own partners. That's not business, it's charity." Richard began to defend himself, explaining his new business philosophy, but he realized he was losing the battle. The investors shook their heads disapprovingly, and some were already scribbling numbers in their notepads. "Perhaps it's best we dissolve our partnership," said Edward. "Nothing personal, Richard, but business is business." It was at that moment the door opened and Emily entered, followed by more than 20 company employees. Richard was surprised, as he hadn't asked anyone to attend. "Excuse me," said Emily, addressing the investors. "We heard about the meeting and came to speak about your boss." "This is irregular," protested Jeffrey. "This is a private meeting." "Let them speak," said Edward, curious to hear. One by one, the people who worked with Richard began to share how their lives had improved after his changes. Betty, from cleaning, told how he had helped when her son needed surgery. Robert, the driver, spoke about the support he received when his wife became unemployed. Jessica, from accounting, explained how the new work environment had reduced her stress and improved her productivity. "Before, we worked in fear," said Michael, the construction supervisor. "Now we work with pleasure, and when people work happily, they produce more and better." "That's very touching," interrupted Jeffrey, "but it doesn't pay dividends." "Actually, it does," said Emily, showing a spreadsheet. "Productivity has increased 20% in recent months. Employee turnover has dropped to nearly zero, saving training costs. And clients who know our new way of working are more satisfied and referring other clients." The investors exchanged glances, surprised by the data presented. They hadn't expected Richard's weakness to be generating practical results. "Besides," continued Emily, "you're only evaluating immediate numbers. A company with a good reputation is worth more in the long run than one that only thinks about immediate profit." Edward took the spreadsheet and examined the numbers carefully. Other investors moved closer to see as well. "Is this data real?" he asked. "Completely verifiable," replied Emily, "and it's likely to improve even further because happy employees are loyal and productive employees." The genuine support from the employees impressed the investors. They had never seen workers spontaneously defend an employer. Jeffrey realized his plan had failed and tried one last move. "This is all staged," he said. "Richard paid these people to come here." "No one paid us anything," replied Betty, the cleaning lady, with dignity. "We came because we wanted to. This man treated me like a person for the first time in 40 years of work." The meeting ended with the investors deciding to maintain the partnership, but now with genuine respect for the new Richard. Jeffrey left humiliated, unable to destroy his rival. When everyone had gone, Richard was alone with Emily in his office. "How did you know about the meeting?" he asked. "Robert, your driver, overheard you talking and told me," she replied. "The people who work for you were worried. They wanted to help." "I never thought anyone would do this for me," said Richard, visibly moved. "That's what happens when you treat people well," explained Emily. "They give back when you need it." In the following months, Richard's company not only survived the crisis but prospered solidly. New clients appeared, attracted by the company's ethical reputation. Talented employees from other companies asked to work there, knowing they would be treated with respect. Richard decided to organize a special event at the Wellington, the same place where it had all begun. He invited all the company's employees, including Margaret, the waitress he had humiliated months before. When Mrs. Margaret arrived at the restaurant, she hesitated upon seeing Richard. The memories of that terrible night were still fresh in her mind. "Mrs. Margaret," said Richard, approaching her, "I need to ask for your forgiveness." The silver-haired woman looked at him in surprise. It was the first time she had seen Richard without that arrogant expression on his face. "I was cruel to you that night," he continued. "I have no excuse for my behavior. I can only ask that you forgive me and promise that I will never treat anyone that way again." To the shock of everyone present, Richard knelt before Mrs. Margaret, completely reversing the scene from that fateful night. "Please get up," said Mrs. Margaret with tears in her eyes. "I already forgave you when I saw that you had truly changed." The gesture deeply moved everyone who was there. Richard had come a long way since that night when he humiliated an honest worker. During dinner, Richard made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've decided to change the structure of our company," he said, standing before the employees. "Starting next month, all of you will share in the company's profits. When the company earns more, you will earn more too." The news was met with applause and tears of joy. They had never imagined a boss could be so generous. "Furthermore," Richard continued, "we will create a scholarship program for our employees' children and a support fund for small entrepreneurs in our community." Emily, who was sitting next to Mrs. Evelyn, now recovered from surgery, smiled proudly. The arrogant and cruel man she had met months before had transformed into someone compassionate and generous. Mrs. Evelyn, who now considered Richard a son, was moved to see him giving genuine smiles to everyone present. She remembered the first times he had visited her apartment, so lost and bitter, and now she saw him radiating true happiness. "You did it, dear," whispered Mrs. Evelyn to Emily. "You showed him the way back home." "He was the one who had the courage to change, Mother," replied Emily. "I just threw orange juice on his head." Both laughed at the memory, now that everything had turned into something positive. 3 months later, on a sunny Saturday morning, Richard received a visit from a young entrepreneur named Tyler Anderson. The 28-year-old had requested a meeting to get advice from someone experienced. "Mr. Blackwell," said Tyler, sitting in Richard's office, "I've heard a lot about your transformation, but I came here because I want to learn how to crush my competitors efficiently." Richard smiled. That arrogant young man reminded him so much of himself just a few months ago. "Let's have lunch," Richard suggested. "I know a good place." Instead of taking Tyler to an expensive restaurant, Richard took him to a simple diner near the Queens neighborhood, where Mrs. Emily had gotten a new part-time job, as she now divided her time between helping Richard at the company and taking care of her mother. "I don't understand," said Tyler, looking around the simple surroundings. "I thought we were going somewhere more suitable for our level." "This place is perfect for our conversation," replied Richard. As they ate sandwiches and drank soda, Richard began to tell his story. He talked about how he used to be, about the night at the restaurant, about Emily and Mrs. Evelyn, about everything he had learned. Tyler laughed when Richard mentioned that a waitress had changed his life. "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell," said Tyler, "but that's self-help talk. In the real business world, kindness is weakness. If you don't crush others, you get crushed." "I used to think that way too," Richard replied calmly. At that moment, Emily passed by them carrying a tray with orders for other tables. Their eyes met and she smiled, waving discreetly. "It took a brave waitress to show me that kindness is the greatest strength there is," continued Richard, looking at Tyler. "Businesses built on respect last forever. Empires built on fear crumble with a simple spilled glass of juice." Tyler looked in Emily's direction, not fully understanding what Richard meant, but something in the sincerity of those words made him reflect. "Do you really believe it's possible to succeed by being nice?" asked Tyler, with a less arrogant tone. "I'm not talking about being nice," explained Richard. "I'm talking about being fair, about remembering that behind every employee, every competitor, every client, there's a person with a family, dreams, and difficulties, just like you and me." "But what if they take advantage of your kindness?" insisted Tyler. "Some will try," admitted Richard, "but most will repay it with loyalty and respect, and in the end, you'll sleep peacefully every night." Tyler stayed silent for a few minutes, processing Richard's words. When he finished eating, he thanked him for lunch and the advice, but Richard noticed the young man still wasn't convinced. "If you change your mind," said Richard, handing him his card, "look me up. But if you decide to continue on the path of cruelty, remember, there's always someone brave enough to throw orange juice on the head of someone who thinks they're untouchable." Tyler left thoughtful, and Richard stayed in the diner waiting for Emily to finish her shift. When she sat beside him late in the afternoon, she asked about the young businessman. "He reminded me of myself some time ago," said Richard. "I think I planted a seed. Maybe one day it will grow." "And if it doesn't grow?" asked Emily. "Then he'll miss the best things in life like I almost did," replied Richard. "But at least I tried to show him another way." As they walked together to the apartment where Evelyn was waiting for them for dinner, Richard reflected on how his life had completely changed. He was no longer the most feared man in New York City, but he was truly respected. He was no longer afraid to show vulnerability because he had learned that true strength comes from compassion. "Emily," he said, stopping at the corner, "you saved my life that night at the restaurant." "I just threw juice on your head," she replied, laughing. "You did more than that," insisted Richard. "You showed me who I really was underneath all that anger and arrogance. You gave me a family. You taught me it's possible to be strong and kind at the same time." "You were the one who had the courage to change," said Emily. "Many people go their whole lives without being able to admit they're wrong." When they arrived at the building, Evelyn was at the window waiting for them, as she did every night. She waved happily and shouted that dinner was almost ready. "A real family," murmured Richard, smiling. "That's right," agreed Emily. "Who would have thought it all started with a glass of orange juice? They went up together in the noisy elevator, talking about plans for the weekend. Richard had suggested taking Evelyn for a walk in the park, something she loved but rarely got to do. That night, during the simple but lovingly prepared dinner, Richard looked around the small table and felt immense gratitude. He had lost his reputation as the city's most feared man, but he had gained something much more valuable, a family that loved him for who he was, not for what he had. Before sleeping, as he did every night, Richard silently thanked that brave waitress who had the audacity to pour orange juice on the head of the most powerful man in the restaurant, and without knowing it, poured compassion into his dried-up heart as well. Outside, New York City remained the same big, impersonal city as always, but for Richard Blackwell, every day was a new opportunity to prove that people can change, that kindness is a courageous choice, and that sometimes the biggest transformations begin with the smallest gestures. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this incredible story of transformation. Do you believe people can really change like Richard changed? Leave your honest opinion in the comments. I love reading what you all think. And don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories that touch the heart.